Will moving Kris Bubic to the rotation be the right move for the Royals? We'll talk about it in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can find us on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you're a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, well, typically I'm based in Kansas City, but as you've known by now in the last couple of episodes, I am away on vacation for Thanksgiving break or just Thanksgiving week. Since I'm out of college at this point, I'm no longer in school, don't have those breaks. It's just a few days off that you can take and spend time with family. So I'm actually in Texas for this next week or so, doing some episodes anywhere I can really do them. Our first episode we did here was in the garage. Then I was able to do one in one of the spare rooms. Today, as you can tell, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm actually outside. So if the quality doesn't sound as great as it usually does, maybe I can blame it on that and say it's due to being outside, though it's nice enough, even though it is the day before Thanksgiving, November 27th. I think it's a little bit colder back in Kansas City last time that I had checked. So, yes, I am doing this from a chair outside and hoping to give still a very good 30-minute episode on a lot of things that we're going to be going over today, which will be Kris Bubic moving back to the rotation, or at least we think he could be moving back to the rotation. Also, if the Royals would pull the trigger on a trade like this, read an article on ESPN earlier this morning. And then if the Royals could try doing a platoon in center field with Kyle Isbell after acquiring Jonathan India and Joey Wiemer, might make sense for the Royals to have two good defensive outfielders, but not overexpose them and facing righties or lefties every single day. They might be able to do a little bit of a platoon with Joey Wiemer and Kyle Isbell. At least I think the Royals could think about a move like that. But let's kick things off here talking about Kris Bubic. Actually, before we do that, I want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, where new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So back to the topic about Kris Bubic, and if it would make sense for this team to move him to the rotation permanently. We discussed this a little bit yesterday in one of our segments about who would be replacing Brady Singer. I think that the Royals will try to go outside the organization, at least for one of those spots in the rotation, and then maybe have a competition battle once again for the number 5 spot in the rotation. I think Kris Bubic probably goes in that conversation as the number 5 starter, mainly because he hasn't started since 2023, and it was just a handful of starts that he made in 2023 before he had season-ending surgery. He had success out of the bullpen. I think a lot of Royals fans were very satisfied with where he was placed in the bullpen, the role that he had in that bullpen, and how he looked. I mean, it wasn't just the eye test. There was also the advanced numbers to back it up. The overall numbers were great. And I think I was one of those people that said there's no need to move him. I mean, the bullpen was an issue for this team for a large chunk of 2024. And when you have that type of issue, it feels a little bit counterproductive to take one of your better guys and put him in the rotation as a number 5 starter. Because my thinking was the number 5 starter is really just somebody you're hoping to get, 150 innings out of. You're not looking at him as one of the guys who's an innings eater. He's not somebody that's going to go out there and shut it down over 7 innings. It can happen, but your expectations are certainly lessened for a number 5 guy in the rotation. And that's why I looked at Kris Bubic's role as a setup guy. It made more sense for me, to put him in that spot and leave him in that spot. Because right now, the Royals, I don't think, have that firm answer to who can be the setup guy unless they go spend some money on another free agent pitcher. And I know they have a lot of hope, actually, for Hunter Harvey, for him to bounce back, not look as poor as he did for the Royals in 2024. It's still a big if there. And I think Kris Bubic is a little bit more of a sure thing than what Hunter Harvey could be for the Royals in 2024. But again, we get back to this point with J.J. Picollo in how he views Kris Bubic. I think him saying we view Kris Bubic as a starter doesn't mean that he's locked in for the rotation. I think that is meaning that they still want to give him a chance to win a spot in the rotation. I think you could see him getting starts in spring training. They're going to try to stretch him out a little bit. But if it doesn't work out, if the numbers aren't as great, or, maybe there is that concern of getting injured once again, then you put him back in the bullpen where he's pitching once every 3 or 4 days, but he's also pitching just 1 inning, right? He's the setup guy for Lucas Erceg. But I do think I've come around a little bit to the idea of Kris Bubic being moved into the rotation. Because from what we saw in 2023 and what he looked like coming off of Tommy John surgery is, I think, the best version we've ever seen of Kris Bubic. And honestly, in that lost 2023 year, which maybe you can look back on it a little better now because the Royals went to the postseason the following year. So when you learned a lot about different guys who could actually be there, where the Royals needed to address it, Kris Bubic didn't really get that chance to put his name in the conversation for the rotation for 2024. I firmly believe that if Kris Bubic was able to have an entire season in 2023 and he made all those adjustments that Brian Sweeney and Zach Bove had him do, I think he would have been a lock for the rotation going into 2024. It may have also meant that they didn't go after a Michael Walker or Seth Lugo, so maybe it all worked out in the end. But again, that point of how he looked is something I believe the Royals are trying to really channel. I think that that's one of the things they are trying to hold on to. It's what they're shooting for. They believe the ceiling is there. They believe the potential is still in there. And I don't think you need to go into this season saying, hey, you don't want him to be a starter because of injury concerns. I mean, Tommy John surgery happens to a lot of guys out there. We know that a majority of big league starters out there have had that surgery at one point in their career. So I don't think it's necessary to make injury concerns a reason for not starting him. My whole reasoning was he was locked down in the bullpen. That's as good as he's ever looked, and the bullpen has a lot of holes in it, right? You're going to need to fill some of those holes with guys that need to improve next year. Maybe you go through free agency, maybe you go through trade. I just thought that Erceg and Bubic in the back end of the bullpen felt pretty solidified. But if you want to go this route of putting him in the starting rotation, I mean, you get that version of what Kris Bubic was in 2023, and it's somewhere in between where that was and what he looked like in the bullpen. That's a better 4 and 5 starter than I think Brady Singer was last year. I think that's certainly better than what Alec Marsh was able to give you. And you could take this rotation to the next level. We know there's going to be some regression from this rotation just because it's unlikely you get 200-plus innings again from Seth Lugo. It's unlikely you get that many innings from Michael Walker. Maybe you do, right? But even if you get that number of innings, you might not be getting the success. You might not be getting the 3.00 ERA. You might not be getting the 224 strikeouts from Cole Ragans. And I think the Royals are going to have to ask themselves, who gives us the best chance of really shining, of surprising us, of doing what Brady Singer did last year, which was a 180-ish inning workload, right? An ERA that's under 4. Who gives us that chance? And I think when they look at in-house options, Kris Bubic gives them that best chance. And I think with the spin rate, I think with the pitches that he's thrown, I think you could make that transition pretty easily to the rotation. And he might be one of those guys as well that they just think is too good to be throwing 1 inning every time he goes out there, or maybe 2 max. If you stretch him out and you lengthen him out, I mean, he's somebody that could be one of the more surprise pitchers in the rotation. And I think really for all the American League, I mean, I think Kris Bubic has that type of look to him where he can make that transition seamless once again. And, he's got somebody like Seth Lugo who had the transition from the bullpen to the rotation. It's not quite the same, of course, because Kris Bubic has started before. He's just never been that successful of a starter for an entire season. He's pitched entire years before, but the numbers were never that great. I think he can make that next jump. I think that this is where he can become a mainstay in this rotation. But first and foremost, he's going to have to get stretched out. He's going to have to lengthen out. And then he's also going to have to be one of those guys that proves I can stay healthy when lengthening out. As I said, I don't think it's a matter of fearing it or trying to proceed with caution, because that's everybody in baseball, right? Cole Ragans had the 2 Tommy John surgeries. You don't go into 2025 going, well, fingers crossed he doesn't get hurt. You do that for everybody. And that's why I think with Kris Bubic, you don't really need to coddle him when it comes to moving him to the rotation, asking him to throw more, because he can build up his arm to do that, and he can do that over the course of the offseason. Just making sure he's working out a little differently. I think last year it's completely different because he's recovering. This time around, he's got the success of what he did in the setup role for the Royals in 2024, and now you're building to become a starter once again, actually. So with Kris Bubic, I like the potential. I like what the Royals see there, and I think I'm somebody that has come around on the idea of moving him back to the rotation. I was against it at first because I was taking on the mentality of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think in the bullpen, nothing was really broke there. That was as good as Kris Bubic has ever looked as a member of the Royals and in his big league career, which has all been with the Royals, of course. So I don't hate the idea. We'll see what happens come spring training, and we'll certainly see what happens at the winter meetings if the Royals try to add anybody to that rotation. But if it came down to a competition spot for the number 5 spot, and it was Kris Bubic, Alec Marsh, Noah Cameron, Kyle Wright, Daniel Lynch, I think Kris Bubic wins it, and I don't think it would actually be that close. All right, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, I read this article on ESPN for one team, or actually all the teams, to make one move this offseason. It had to be a pretty big move for it to be notable, and you'll be pretty surprised at who the Royals were trading with and which player they were getting and which player they were giving up. We'll dive into that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our one and only sponsor today in FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And for my pick, I'm going to have a Thanksgiving Day pick going to that Giants and Cowboys game. Surprise, surprise, I'm in Texas, so I might as well pick a Cowboys game. I am going to take the over on passing yards for Cooper Rush. Maybe not going to be the best pick for me, but since I'm here with family that are Cowboys fans, I am going to have to pick one for the Cowboys. So I'll take the over on passing yards for Cooper Rush, the backup for Dallas going into this game. Okay, so let's go into this article that ESPN put out there this morning. I believe it was Dave Schoenfield that wrote it. It was pretty intriguing to me, considering that all of the teams were mentioned, because this article was titled "One Big Move for Every Team This Offseason." And so naturally, I thought it would be interesting to just scroll through everybody else and see what if the Royals were matched with any of these other teams. But as it turned out, it wasn't until I got to the actual Royals trade that they were mentioned in this article. So even though there were, I think, better options, better fits in the first couple trades and offseason signings I was seeing, this was the move that really opened my eyes a little bit. And not that there's any rumor to it, not that there's any smoke to it or really anything by it. It was just a move that this writer thought would make a lot of sense for both sides with the Royals and the Cardinals, actually. So this trade was the Royals acquiring Ryan Helsley, who was the league leader in saves. He's been electric for St. Louis really ever since he took over that closer's role. And then going to St. Louis was maybe my favorite prospect, not named Jack Caglione in the system, and Blake Walters. I think my first reaction to it was this would not be enough for Ryan Helsley. And the second part of it was I'm surprised in this article a closer was mentioned for the Royals, because Lucas Ursig is coming off closing out games in the postseason. He's probably primed to have a big 2025 in a lot of people's eyes. And Ryan Helsley is pitching for St. Louis. That's the third part about this. And I don't think a trade that big would happen between these two teams. Not that you're hanging up the phone because the Royals called or vice versa. I don't see these teams dealing a lot with each other, even though there have been moments where it made sense for the Royals to trade somebody to the Cardinals and for the Cardinals to trade somebody to the Royals. But with the state of this bullpen, even though we just talked about Kris Bubic maybe moving to the rotation and leaving another spot there, I don't think closer is a needed thing for this team. Lucas Ursig is that guy. If you're a believer in Hunter Harvey, then you have your 8th and 9th inning guy right there. You know John Schreiber is going to be throwing in a lot of late game situations. Maybe Angel Serpa once again can be that guy. He sure as hell was in the postseason. You'll have Sam Long back. Maybe somebody like Steven Cruz can make a big jump for this team out of spring training. But I thought there were so many other matches for the Royals if they are to make a trade again than going to St. Louis, calling about the asking price of Ryan Helsley. And I'll be honest with you, with what is said in the organization about Blake Walters, I view him as somebody that's a little bit untouchable right now. I think that even though his numbers weren't as impressive in his first year of professional ball in Kansas City, or with Kansas City, I should say, he is somebody they have huge hopes for. He is somebody that might have the biggest ceiling of anybody in that farm system. And I'm including Jack Caglione in this. I mean, Blake Walters being a 17-year-old and 18-year-old that can run it up near 100 miles an hour and have plus pitches for, a slider. And I think there's also a changeup that goes along with it. That can all profile to be an elite front line guy down the road. If the Royals were saying, hey, our window is now, we are looking to build an HDH-like bullpen, I'll be honest, I kind of fantasized a little bit about Lucas Erceg and Ryan Helsley being paired up in the back end of the bullpen. But I think it would still hurt a little bit to give up somebody like Blake Walters, who really down the road could be a fantastic superstar for somebody in the rotation. And hopefully that rotation is in Kansas City. And I think the Royals have that belief that he and Ben Kudrna and Hero Wyatt, they've got that mold, they've got that ceiling where you trade him somewhere else and he gets in the right hands of an organization that can really develop starting pitching, you're going to be kicking yourself down the road, because relievers and closers, the shelf life for them is so small, right? It is such a small amount of time to dominate in the league. And Ryan Helsley has been a dominant arm, one of the better closers of the last 2 to 3 years. But there's going to be a fall off. The same thing's going to happen with Lucas Erceg as well. You're hoping that the mileage on his arm, which isn't a lot, is going to hold up longer. Because he was a position player, then he became a pitcher, and he hasn't been throwing that long, so there's not a ton of work on that arm. Still, when you look at the numbers for closers and the great ones out there, yeah, you can have that outlier where they're great for 10, 15, 16 years of a career, like a Mariano Rivera. Oftentimes, they'll have that great 3 to 4 year stretch, and then they start declining. And if you were to acquire Ryan Helsley, as this article has on ESPN, and you give up Blake Walters, well, what if that decline happens after this year? Or what if it happens this year? I mean, he's significantly worse than what he was in 2024. Now you're just hoping and praying that Blake Walters doesn't turn into a superstar, and that's something the Royals believe he can be. With the development process they have for him, with the pitching department they're going to have, and all the eyeballs on this organization, Blake Walters is somebody that I think they view not just as a big league starter. I think they view him down the road as a number 1 or a number 2. And now you've got that confidence going a little bit with how you were able to fix Cole Reagans, how you were able to make Seth Lugo look, and certainly credit goes to those guys. But coming off this year where everybody in the rotation seemed to have an up year, you're kind of getting that confidence of, we can do that now at the minor league level. We can see some of these guys with great ceilings, great potential, make that move to the next level. And if the Royals thought they needed a closer, I think it would just be easier to go out there and maybe try to spend money on a Clay Holmes, or you go out there to spend some money on somebody like Carlos Estevez, Tanner Scott, if you really want to put a lot of money into it. I just don't view that as a likely move for them. And again, with these articles on ESPN or articles anywhere that you read on potential trades, or this would make sense. We talked about Jurickson Profar the other day. There are writers in baseball that have a pulse on the game and certainly know what executives are saying out there, what they could be looking for. Oftentimes you read some of those great pieces by a Jeff Passan or a Ken Rosenthal. They'll bring up names that we aren't even talking about, or not Royals fans, not even, anybody involved with the Royals. We're not talking about those names, and then they pop up in those articles. It starts to make the wheels spin a little bit, and it's interesting about it. Jonathan India was somebody I hadn't really had on my radar until that first article about 3 or 4 weeks ago popped up, where he would make sense as a leadoff bat for the Royals. there was a lot of smoke to it, and that smoke turned into a fire. I think when it came to this trade, it was more so of the Royals bullpen struggled a lot last year. They didn't really have a defined closer. Even Lucas Erceg would come in earlier, and this would make it easier on them. And Blake Walters is somebody that they're really high on, and the Cardinals are somebody that can develop pitching. They've done it a lot throughout their time in the 2010s of being able to get average to maybe below average guys and turn them into frontline ones at the big league level. They've also had their failures. That certainly happened before, as has with every team in Major League Baseball. But to me, I think that it was almost putting too much stock into Blake Walters, what's been said about him, because I don't think the Cardinals would pull the trigger on that trade. And I don't think the Royals would hate it if the Cardinals turned down that type of offer, because Blake Walters is somebody I don't believe they would want to put in any sort of trade deal unless it was an absolute haul for them. And just for one name, and even though it's one of the better closers out there, a guy that led the league in saves last year, I think they feel good about Lucas Erceg and don't want to give up any of their untouchable guys down there in the minor league level. Okay, we're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, will the Royals go with a platoon in center field, or will Kyle Isbell be, once again, the everyday center fielder in Kansas City? We'll talk about that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. The last little segment that we are going to go over here is about the Royals center field decision going into 2025, the options they'll have, and if they'll take a different approach compared to what they did in 2024, which was run Kyle Isbell out there for nearly every single game when he was healthy. I think this addition of Joey Wiemer is more intriguing than you may think right now, because Jonathan India was the main piece in this deal. Joey Wiemer is somebody that has not had good success at the big league level. He was a former top 100 prospect. There's stuff to like there, but there's a difference between ceiling and potential and who they actually are, what they have done so far in their big league career. And Joey Wiemer just hasn't been good. I mean, he's been pretty bad in his big league career, and he's not had many chances to be an everyday player. And I don't think that he'll be an everyday player in Kansas City, but with his defense and what we've seen at the minor league level, there's a thought that popped in my mind about what if, Joey Wiemer, somebody you can get out there more than once a week, or maybe you have to stick him in AAA. And there's this possibility that Kyle Isbell, somebody, they love his defense out there, and the only way they would platoon Kyle Isbell is if they had a good defensive center fielder to replace him with on days that they were facing a lefty, because Kyle Isbell just didn't really have that good of splits against lefties in 2024 and really in his entire career. Now, Joey Wiemer does not have great numbers against lefties, but it's significantly better than what we saw against righties in his big league career. So against righties, he's hit 169 with a 291 OBP and an OPS of 552. Against lefties in his career, which he's got 133 at-bats against, he's got a 263 average with a 295 OBP and a 481 slug for a 776 OPS. That, to me, is something to take into account. And if the defense, it doesn't need to get as good as Kyle Isbell's, but if it's an above-average defense out there in center field, I think it would make a lot of sense for the Royals to go with a platoon situation out there in center, because you're getting value for two guys you went out there to acquire in Joey Wiemer and Jonathan India, and you might be helping out Kyle Isbell a little bit, because at this point in his career, I'm not sure he's ever going to get the bat working for him. I'm not sure that being an offensive threat is something that Kyle Isbell is soon to do, or that's in his future. I think that his abilities is being a great defender in center field, and from time to time can be a league average hitter at the bottom of the order. It's not a consistent thing, though, right? So many times you've heard us say on this podcast that if Kyle Isbell could be a league average hitter for the entire year, you're talking about somebody who can be one of the more valuable center fielders in all of baseball, because the defense is that good. Well, I think you can go and maybe try to simplify it a little bit more. I think you can look at him as a starting outfielder, not so much of a fourth or a fifth guy, but he's not an everyday guy. I mean, with the way that Matt Quatrero likes to platoon, with the way the Royals lineup is constructed, now you look at the 9-hole out there, if Kyle Isbell plays against righties, I think it gives him a chance to be a little bit more comfortable, to see better pitches, to really have a chance to have the best offensive numbers of his entire career. And then against lefties, you just don't need to overdo it, because Kyle Isbell to me is not an everyday player, but I think he's an incredibly valuable guy. And they love the defense out there. And the only reason they couldn't really platoon with him out there in center is nobody was good enough defensively to do that. If Joey Wiemer can make that jump, as we've seen him do at the minor league level, and he has a great arm, he's athletic enough, he's a big dude. If he can roam center field, maybe 80% as good as Kyle Isbell does, I think it makes a ton of sense to platoon both of these guys, because I believe there is talent in Joey Wiemer's bat. I think there's talent as an overall ball player. But again, like Kyle Isbell, I don't think he's an everyday center fielder. I think there are aspects to like. In the same way, there's stuff to like about Kyle Isbell's bat and Kyle Isbell's glove. But the Royals can't really make that commitment to platoon those guys if Joey Wiemer doesn't come around defensively. He doesn't get better, because in his big league career, he hasn't been that great of a defender. I think the minor league numbers have shown a better ability to chase down balls. He's got a great arm, of course. I think the speed can develop too, and just having good range out there in the outfield. But we all know he's not going to be as good as Kyle Isbell in center field because of how good Kyle Isbell is in center field. He's one of the best defensive outfielders in the game, and the Royals value that a lot. That's why they wanted Kyle Isbell to be the everyday center fielder. I remember right after the 2023 season when J.J. Picollo was going over this year of evaluation. It was a year they wanted to see if Bobby Witt Jr. could be an everyday shortstop, or really just be their guy, the one to build around. They found that out. They wanted to see who could show up in the rotation, if Brady Singer could be a guy they could count on, if Cole Reagans, once they acquired him, could make that transition to the rotation. And Kyle Isbell was one of those bullet points of we wanted to see that he could be an everyday center fielder, and they got enough in 2023 to give him that job in 2024. And I do think he made strides. I think he made jumps. I think he got a little bit unlucky with the injuries and the timing of those injuries, because in the second half, there were points in time where Kyle Isbell was one of the hotter hitters in that lineup. But when you've got a big enough sample size on guys, and you're still talking about potential, well, they could be this, they can reach that ceiling, I think you need to have a bit of a reality check and go, this is who they're going to be. But we can make them a better version of themselves if we take stuff off them. It's why with MJ Melendez, I don't think the Royals go into 2025 saying he's our everyday left fielder. I think you have to get more creative with how you use him. Maybe he is a bench bat. Maybe he's somebody you just value as a pinch hitter, and he can be a defensive replacement if need be. He is athletic enough. He's got the arm, kind of like Joey Wiemer, but he's never going to be somebody to play center field, and he's a lefty. For Kyle Isbell, I think that you see what he can be. I think the ceiling is a 230 to 240 hitter. His on base is always going to be around the low 300s. At times when he's really struggling, well below that, in the 280, 290. But to me, I think the bat is what it's going to be. And I think defensively, that's what he's going to be as well. So why not take away those games where he's facing lefties and throw him in there against righties? Because Kyle Isbell, I think, can be that bat you're hoping to have when he's just facing righties out there. And that was something the Royals significantly struggled with a handful of their lefties, is that they just didn't have a righty to platoon with them. And when you were slumping, when the offense was struggling, you had guys that were just not good at all and facing, the same-handed pitcher of where they were batting from. The lefties out there that struggled, or, like MJ Melendez had really bad splits against lefties. Kyle Isbell, he did have a 232 average, a 295 OBP, which was a little bit better than righties. That was over the course of his entire career. You go back to 2024, if I'm not mistaken, the splits were just not that good for Kyle Isbell. Yeah, against lefties, it was 161 with a 224 OBP. So it goes back to my point of, in his career, the splits are relatively the same. But last year, there was that big dip where he hit 161 against lefties, a 224 OBP, and a slug of 226. That's just not good enough to put out there against lefties, when Joey Wiemer, as I said, against lefties, he's a better version of himself. 263 average, 295 OBP. It's not good. It's not anything that you're going to be overly excited about. But at the end of the day, that's an upgrade. And if he can be good enough defensively, I think it makes a lot of sense to platoon those guys. Because Kyle Isbell against righties hit 242 with the 299 OBP and a slug of 394. So that took a big jump up in 2024. And he spent a lot of time facing righties back then. Against lefties this year, he was just 10 for 62 at the plate. Anywhere you can get a slight advantage, I think it's worth it for the Royals to do. So will a platoon with Joey Wiemer and Kyle Isbell in center field? The only way that can happen is if Joey Wiemer can become a very good defensive center fielder, and they would feel comfortable with him roaming the outfield on days Kyle Isbell is not. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. I appreciate everybody being all right with me doing the episode outside. Have to get a little bit more creative. We're not in our usual home, in our usual podcasting room. But again, thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second, find Locked On MLB, as Baseball Guru Soli brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tomorrow, we're going to bring you a Thanksgiving episode, probably in the morning time, because it's the only time I'm going to have to do an episode. And then we'll be back to usual on Friday. We'll be back in our podcasting room, aren't going to be jumping around doing the show in different places. So we'll be back to normal then. But until tomorrow, you take it easy, Kansas City.